Hi everyone! Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a basting stitch, and a basting stitch is basically a reinforcement or a temporary hold to keep the fabric in place. And it's going to be long stitches running back and forth of both sides of the fabric. I have two fabric swatches here to show you how to do this. And I have my thread. I already put it through my needle here. And you can see how I have this small needle, but once you guys get into hand sewing, you're going to find that you have different size of needles. And I also have this large needle here, but the larger the needle is, the more thicker it's going to be, and the eye of the needle is going to be bigger because it's going to be used for heavier fabrics versus the smaller and thinner needles are going to be used for lighter weight fabrics. Currently I'm using a pretty lightweight cotton. So I'm going to be sticking with this small, thin needle here. And I'm going to just be using one layer of thread. But if I chose to use 2 layers of thread, that's fine too. But for this tutorial, I'm only going to be needing 1 layer. But I am going to show you a trick of how to knot this end because everyone always has trouble knotting this end. But if you just pinch the thread here, and wrap it around your finger, and using your thumb just roll it out like this and pinch using your middle finger both sides and pull it through, you can then create a knot. And I just like to tighten that knot by pulling both ends of the thread, and then I will clip this and just to make it a little bit cleaner. Like that, I have a knot. And you could use this trick for 2 layers of thread, 4 layers of thread, however many layers of thread you need, it's gonna work for that. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start using my basting stitch, and I'm gonna go ahead and mark a 1/2 inch seam allowance for this. What is a 1/2 inch seam allowance? I'm gonna do the back. I'm gonna notch this back. Okay, so like I mentioned, what is a 1/2 inch seam allowance? Is the space in between your actual stitch line. This is the stitch line where I'm going to be doing my basting stitch, and then the edge of the fabric. And this width, seam allowance width, is going to be determined based off of whatever stitch you do. If you do a French seam, if you do a flat felt, if you do a regular seam with just an overlock at the end of this fabric edge, that all is going to vary your seam allowance, the width of this space. So since I'm just doing a regular basting stitch, I'm going to be doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And keep in mind, you will always need a seam allowance or this space in between the stitch line and the fabric edge, because if you start your stitching right here on that fabric edge, that's going to fray and it's going to come apart very quickly. So you're always going to need some kind of space, and that width is just going to be determined by whatever stitch you do. I marked my seam allowance line, my stitch line here, using my mechanical chalk pencil, and I went ahead and notched the back here as well, 1/2 inch, because I always like to keep my thread, this knot of the end of the thread, at the back of my fabric, or I like to hide it. I just think it looks nicer. So I notched it here so I can make sure I start from the back to hide that knot. And then I'm just gonna follow that stitch line that I drew and go up and down, and it's gonna be a wider stitch since this is a basting stitch. And I'm just gonna try to keep it as even as possible. And for this basting stitch, since it's a temporary stitch, you don't really have to be super precise about the width of each stitch, but it's just good to practice consistency throughout. And as I'm basting, I'm not gonna want this little wrinkle here or ruffle. I'm gonna want it to be smooth as possible. So I'm just gonna keep on going up and down my fabric and using my fingers to navigate that, like so. I'm pulling my fabric through, making sure it's flat. And this is my last stitch here. So I'm gonna end at the back of my thread, back of my fabric as well. And I'm gonna have to create a knot to reinforce this so it doesn't come apart. And another trick of how to create an ending knot right against your fabric is if you lay your needle right against the end of that thread where you stop or ended, you're just gonna loop it 1, 2, 3, 2 or 3 times around that needle is fine. And then you're gonna pinch it down, put a little bit of pressure so you could keep those loops in place while you take out that needle. You're gonna pinch it now and pull that thread all the way through, and like that you created a knot, you can see here. And then another trick I like to do so I don't have to knot this again is I usually just create a small stitch next to the first knot I did, and then I'll just do one more. 1, 2, 3, wrap around that needle to create another knot, pull that needle through, pinch it so it gets that fabric, and create a second knot. And now I'm just going to trim the thread after that. So now it gives me a knot to start my next project of hand stitching, and it also gave me a knot here. And like that, that is the basting stitch.